114 degrees. That's what Las Vegas hit on Friday, the hottest day of the year so far, in a city that just broke a 6-day streak above 110. 900 miles northwest, in a state that has never once issued this warning in its history. Forecasters put out a particularly dangerous situation alert on Friday morning, one step above red flag, reserved for conditions meteorologists call truly dangerous. And 1,300 miles east of that, the Storm Prediction Center has severe thunderstorms drawn across the Ozarks for this afternoon, with enough instability in the air to fuel 60-mile-an-hour wind gusts. 3 states, 3 separate warnings, 3 separate news stories, if you're watching the way most people watch the news. They are not separate. One feature in the atmosphere is doing all 3 at once, and the same government document that describes it contains a sentence almost nobody has read. The ridge responsible for this will weaken slightly and then, 4 words later in the same paragraph, re-intensify. It isn't breaking, it's ducking. If you want to understand what's actually sitting over this country right now, and not just the piece of it hitting your city, subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. This pattern is going to keep producing headlines for the next 2 weeks, and I'll be tracking every one of them. Drop a comment and tell me what the temperature is where you are right now, because I want to see how wide this spread actually gets across this audience. Now, let's get into it. Part 1. The sentence at the bottom of the page. On the 28th of July, the Weather Prediction Center in College Park, Maryland, published its extended forecast discussion for the last week of the month. Most of it is the kind of dry technical language nobody outside a meteorology office ever reads. But buried in the pattern overview, in triple asterisks, the kind of formatting a forecaster uses when they want to make sure you don't skim past it was this. Long duration heatwave expected for much of the western US and western high plains. And then, 1 line down, the number. An impressive 600 decameter upper ridge will be large and in charge across the western US for the end of the week and starting the month of August. Large and in charge. That is not hedged language. That is not possible or conditional. That is a government forecaster telling you 4 days in advance that a structure in the atmosphere was about to take over the weather for a third of a continent, and it would still be sitting there on the 1st of August. It is still sitting there right now. Here's what that ridge has already done, and it's Friday. In Las Vegas, Harry Reid International Airport reached 114 degrees, the hottest day of 2026, with the weekend forecast pushing toward 115, within a degree of the all-time August record of 116, set in 1979. But here's the number the meteorologist on duty in Las Vegas actually flagged as the real concern, and it isn't the one in the headline, it's the overnight low. It won't drop below 90 in many parts of the valley. The average low for this time of year is 83. That's not a hot day. That's a body that never gets to recover before the next one starts. 900 miles to the northwest, on the opposite edge of that same ridge, the National Weather Service issued a particularly dangerous situation red flag warning for central and eastern Washington, the first one ever issued for that state, winds gusting to 50 miles an hour. Relative humidity as low as 15%, nearly 2 million acres already burned across the Pacific Northwest this season. And one state fire official described what's coming as simply explosive. A red flag warning tells you conditions are dangerous. A particularly dangerous situation tells you the people who write those warnings for a living looked at the numbers and decided the standard label wasn't strong enough. And on the eastern flank of the same pattern, in the Ozarks and the middle Mississippi Valley, the Storm Prediction Center has instability values reaching 4,000 joules per kilogram this afternoon. Fuel for thunderstorms capable of 60-mile-an-hour wind gusts, large hail, and an isolated tornado risk stretching from Missouri into western Illinois, St. Louis, Columbia, Springfield, all under the same slight risk on the same afternoon because a cold front is dragging along the eastern edge of the very ridge that's baking Las Vegas and threatening to burn down parts of Washington. One ridge. A near-record heat wave on one side, a first-in-state history fire warning on another, severe thunderstorms on a third. And the forecast for what happens next isn't relief, it's repetition. The same discussion that called this ridge large and in charge also said it will weaken slightly early next week, and then, in the very next clause, re-intensify and push the heat toward the Four Corners, the Central Rockies, and the northern high plains by midweek. This isn't a heat wave passing through. It's a heat wave that leaves and comes back to a different address, and that raises the only question that actually matters for the next 2 weeks. What is a 600 decameter ridge? And why does something with a name that boring have the power to decide the weather for half a country at once? Part 2. What 600 actually means. 19,685 feet. That is the altitude in question, and once you understand why that number matters, the rest of this pattern stops looking like a coincidence and starts looking like arithmetic. Meteorologists don't measure the atmosphere in miles or feet when they're trying to gauge how extreme a heat event actually is. They pick a pressure level, usually 500 millibars, roughly the halfway point of the atmosphere's mass, and they ask a different question entirely. How high up do you have to climb to find it? That sounds backwards until you think about why it works. Warm air is less dense than cold air, so a column of warm air physically takes up more vertical space than a column of cold air containing the same amount of mass. Heat the atmosphere enough, and the whole column puffs upward, which means the elevation where you'd find that 500 millibar pressure level rises with it. 6,000 meters. 600 decameters. 19,685 feet. That's the number the Weather Prediction Center used to describe the ridge sitting over the southwest, and according to the Washington Post's own explainer on how these events work, a 500 millibar height reaching 600 decameters is, in their words, quite rare. Most summers never get there. This one already has. Here's what a forecaster tracking this pattern wrote a full week before it arrived. On the 24th of July, meteorologist Jason Farhang posted an analysis based on the latest European model run, flagging that a heat dome would develop between the 29th of July and the 5th of August, and specifically noting that the 600 decameter heat axis was positioned closer to Southern California, Arizona, Las Vegas, and Utah than in previous events. He predicted an expansion of excessive heat warnings by the 30th. 4 days later, that's exactly the geography the National Weather Service put its warnings on. But here's the part that separates this from an ordinary hot week, and it's the same physics whether it happens in a Nebraska cornfield or over the Mojave Desert. A ridge this tall doesn't just sit there passively, it actively works to sustain itself. Underneath a ridge of high pressure, air is sinking slowly, almost imperceptibly, across an area the size of several states. Sinking air compresses as it descends into higher pressure, and compression heats it, at a rate fixed by basic physics, roughly 5.5 degrees Fahrenheit for every 1,000 feet it falls. That heating has nothing to do with the sun, it's the atmosphere squeezing itself hot. And sinking air can't form clouds. Clouds need rising motion, so the sky underneath a ridge like this one goes clear and stays clear, which means every bit of solar radiation that does arrive reaches the ground with nothing in the way to block it. Then the loop closes. The ground heats. The heated ground warms the air sitting on top of it. That warmed air makes the column taller. A taller column reinforces the ridge above it. A stronger ridge strengthens the sinking motion underneath it. The sinking motion keeps the sky clear. And every single hour of sunshine makes the whole structure slightly better at doing exactly what it's already doing. That's why heat domes are so difficult to dislodge once they're established. They're not a passive weather pattern waiting to be blown away. They're actively maintaining themselves hour by hour off the same sunlight that's baking the ground beneath them. Now, overlay the drought data onto that feedback loop, because this is where a hot ridge becomes a genuinely dangerous one instead of just an uncomfortable one. When sunlight hits well-watered ground, a share of that incoming energy gets spent evaporating moisture rather than raising the temperature the landscape is, in effect, sweating. When it hits drought-stricken ground with nothing left to evaporate, all of that energy has nowhere to go except straight into heating the air. Same sun, same ridge. Hotter afternoon not because the atmosphere intensified, but because the ground stopped cooling itself. And the Pacific Northwest, sitting on the northern flank of this same ridge with nearly 2 million acres already burned this season, isn't just standing next to a heat dome. It's standing on fuel that this exact mechanism has spent weeks drying out. So the ridge isn't one thing happening to the southwest while separate things happen elsewhere. It's a machine with a southwest half that bakes and a northern edge that ignites, and the same 600 decameters explains both. Part 3. The ledger. 64%. That's how much of Washington state was sitting in some category of drought as of the middle of July, according to the US Drought Monitor, up from what had been merely abnormally dry just weeks earlier. Oregon was worse, 88%. Idaho worse still, 81%. And the federal drought coordinator tracking it, a man named Jason Gerlich at the National Integrated Drought Information System, said something in early July that reads differently now than it did when he said it. It's not going to take just one prolonged rain event to move some of these states out of their drought conditions. He said that 3 weeks before the ridge described in the last part of this video ever showed up on a model run. Here's the ledger as it stands right now. The Kaiser Canyon fire in Okanogan County, Washington, the state's largest wildfire of 2026, is burning close to 130,000 acres and sits at 16% contained. 16% means 84% of that fire's perimeter has no control line holding it at all. Across the state line, Oregon's Roe Creek complex, which started from a single lightning strike on the 15th of July, had grown to nearly 143,000 acres by the 30th. Combined, Oregon and Washington have burned past 1.3 million acres this year, more than double what the entire state of Washington burned in all of 2023, and already ahead of the 10-year average for a full fire season, with 2 months of summer still left to run. And here's the detail that connects this ledger back to the ridge instead of treating it as a separate story. Fuel moisture. The actual water content inside the grass, brush, and timber that a wildfire burns through was already tracking below normal in eastern Washington and the Oregon Cascades back in early July, at times hitting record lows according to the same federal briefing that quoted Gerlich. That measurement was taken before this ridge existed. The ridge didn't create the dry fuel. It arrived on top of fuel that had already been drying for weeks, and every hour it holds, it dries that fuel further. The same feedback loop from the last part of this video, just measured in dead grass instead of degrees. That's the mechanism behind Friday's particularly dangerous situation warning. It wasn't a warning about a storm arriving into calm, healthy landscape. It was a warning about wind and low humidity arriving on top of a state that was already 64% in drought, sitting on top of fuel that was already recording lows nobody had seen before, underneath a ridge that a forecaster had flagged 9 days in advance. None of those 4 things is new information on its own. Stacked together, on the same afternoon, they're the reason a state that has never once issued a PDS warning issued one for the first time in its history. Which raises the question this pattern keeps forcing on anyone tracking it closely. How much of this? The drought, the fuel, the timing, the ridge itself, is simply July doing what July does in a hot, dry year, and how much of it is something running hotter than the years this region built its expectations around? To answer that, honestly, you have to go back and look at what a 600 decameter ridge has done the last few times it showed up over this same stretch of country, and how often, historically, that number even appears at all. Part 4, what happened the last time? 5,980 meters. That's the peak height this same 500 millibar level reached over the Pacific Northwest at the end of June 2021. 20 meters short of the 6,000 meter threshold this video keeps circling back to, and according to the peer-reviewed attribution study published afterward, unprecedented for this area of Western North America for the entire 73-year period researchers had reanalysis data for. The ridge that produced it was described by the same paper as an omega block, a shape in the atmospheric flow that traps a high-pressure system in place instead of letting it drift east like weather is supposed to. It parked over southern British Columbia, and it did not move for days. Here's what came out from underneath it. Portland reached 116 degrees. Seattle reached 108. A small town in British Columbia called Lytton broke the all-time Canadian temperature record 3 days in a row, finally topping out at 121 degrees on the 29th of June. A number that, as one report on the event put it, gave Lytton a higher all-time record high than Atlanta, New York, and Chicago. The next day, Lytton burned to the ground in a wildfire. A team at UCLA ran the event through multiple climate models afterward and concluded it was, in their words, a 1 in 10, 000 year event. So far outside the historical range that even accounting for the warming the region has already experienced, it still came up as what one of the researchers called a highly unusual event. 610 people died from it, according to the excess mortality count researchers use when official cause of death records undercount a heat event. A later study tracking pregnancy outcomes in Oregon and Washington found the heat wave measurably raised the odds of preterm birth in mothers who were pregnant during it, a consequence that had nothing to do with anyone standing outside in the sun and everything to do with a ridge sitting overhead for days. Here's the mechanism, in the same physics from 2 parts ago, just with the numbers turned up. The attribution paper identified 3 ingredients stacking on top of each other. The record ridge itself, driving the basic sinking air compression heating described earlier, a supercharger effect, where the position of that ridge relative to a trough off the Northern California coast pulled dry desert air northward from the southwest, and parched soils from an existing drought that had already shut off the landscape's own evaporative cooling. The exact mechanism from the previous part of this video just tested to its limit 5 years earlier on the same stretch of coastline. 3 ordinary ingredients, stacked in exactly the wrong order, at exactly the wrong time, over a region built for temperate summers with minimal air conditioning. And here is the sentence from that same attribution research that matters most for anyone watching this pattern unfold again in 2026. The 2021 event wasn't simply bad luck landing on a warmer planet. The study found it was 59% longer, 34% larger in area, and 6% higher in peak amplitude than the same event would have produced without the warming already baked into the atmosphere. A separate paper modeling the broader pattern found that heat domes of this magnitude, once estimated at roughly 1 in 1,000 years, are now projected at once or twice per decade if global warming reaches 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. A threshold the planet is already most of the way toward. Not because the physics of a ridge changed, because the baseline it's now operating on top of did. None of that means what's sitting over the Southwest and the Pacific Northwest this week is 2021 repeating itself. It isn't, and this video isn't going to pretend it is. The current ridge is centered hundreds of miles south and east of where the 2021 block set up, and nothing so far suggests it's stalling as an omega block the way that one did. But the ingredients being described in real time this week: drought-parched soil, a ridge measured against the same 600 decameter benchmark, dry air pulled north into a region already starved of it, are the same 3 ingredients researchers identified as the reason 2021 became what it became. Which is exactly why the next question matters. Is what's happening right now ordinary July heat in an unusually dry year? Or is it the same recipe assembling itself again, just south of where it landed last time? Part 5. The argument this ridge is already generating. It didn't take long. Earlier this summer, when a heat dome settled over Europe and then North America in late June and early July, posts claiming the heat was weather warfare spread across social media faster than any of the actual forecast discussions did. One executive at a conservative advocacy group told her followers the scorching temperatures around Washington's July 4th celebrations were geoengineered weather deployed to sabotage the White House's plans. The claim named the same target it always names, AAA, the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program, a research facility in Gakona, Alaska, that studies the ionosphere using radio transmitters. I want to take this seriously enough to actually walk through it, rather than laugh it off, because the instinct underneath it isn't stupid. A ridge this extreme, this well forecast, arriving on schedule exactly where models said it would 9 days in advance, does feel like something with an author behind it. But feeling authored and being authored are different claims, and the physics settles this one cleanly. Jennifer Francis, a senior scientist at the Woodwell Climate Research Center, put it about as directly as a scientist ever puts anything when reporters asked her about this exact claim in early July. aka ARP has no influence on weather at all, and anyone who believes it does has no factual understanding of interactions between high-frequency radio waves and the atmosphere. aka ARP's own program manager has said the same thing when asked directly. The facility cannot create or amplify natural disasters. It is, in the words of one federal fact check, basically a large radio transmitter. NOAA's own public fact check page states plainly that the agency has no association with the facility and that it is not capable of influencing local weather at Earth's surface, let alone tropical cyclones thousands of miles away. A sentence that applies with equal force to a ridge of high pressure covering a third of a continent. Here's the scale problem, stated plainly. The ridge described in the second part of this video is a structure roughly 6,000 meters tall, spanning multiple states, sustained by a feedback loop of solar heating and atmospheric compression running continuously across an area the size of several countries. AARP's transmitter, by comparison, is a tool designed to study a thin layer of charged particles far above the weather system entirely. It doesn't reach down into the troposphere where this ridge lives, and even if it did, its total broadcast power is a rounding error against the energy already moving through a single afternoon of subsidence over Nevada. Redirecting or manufacturing a continental heat dome would require restructuring the pressure field across an ocean basin. Nothing built by anyone, anywhere, operates at that scale. What's actually driving the "it must be engineered" instinct, I think, is something worth naming honestly rather than dismissing. The fact that this was forecast so precisely. A forecaster named the geography of this exact heat dome 9 days before it arrived. That kind of accuracy can feel like proof of control. It's the opposite. Chaotic, weakly forced weather patterns are the hardest things in meteorology to predict. Small errors compound fast, and confidence stays low. A ridge this dominant, this strongly forced, is easier to forecast precisely because nothing subtle is fighting it. The predictability is evidence of how completely this pattern has taken over the atmosphere, not evidence that someone is steering it. There's a second claim worth addressing, and it runs in the opposite direction from the first. Not that this is manufactured, but that it's nothing, just an ordinary hot week getting overhyped for clicks. That one doesn't survive contact with the numbers either. 64% of Washington in drought. A state's first ever particularly dangerous situation fire warning. A 500 millibar height brushing against a threshold, a peer-reviewed study called unprecedented the last time this region saw it. Normal Julys don't produce all of that in the same week. The honest position sits between the two loud ones. Nobody engineered this ridge, and it is not nothing either. It's ordinary physics. Sinking air, a warming baseline, a drought-stricken landscape. Running very close to the edge of what this specific stretch of atmosphere has ever been recorded doing. Part 6, what to watch and where, 40 to 60%. That's the number that actually matters for the next 4 days, and it comes from a document almost nobody reads, the Climate Prediction Center's Probabilistic Hazards Outlook, updated for the period running from the 3rd through the 5th of August. It states that the GEFs and ESONs, two of the major global ensemble forecast systems, are, in the document's own words, in good agreement and remain consistent in showing a highly amplified 500 hPa ridge peaking in strength by the end of week 1, before becoming weaker by the start of week 2. Translation: for the next several days, the models are not arguing with each other. That's worth noting, because when they do start disagreeing, which is usually the first sign a pattern is actually about to change, it will show up in this exact document before it shows up anywhere else. Right now, the outlook lists a greater than 60% chance of extreme heat for portions of the Great Basin on the 2nd of August, stepping down to a 40 to 60% moderate risk across the Southern Plains, Southwest, Great Basin, Rockies, and California for the 3rd through the 5th. And the same document notes that risk band has been shrinking over the Southern Plains compared to the past several forecasts. That's the ridge doing exactly what the Weather Prediction Center said it would 2 parts ago. Not braking, ducking. The heat is contracting out of Texas and Oklahoma and pulling back toward the Four Corners in California, which is precisely the re-intensify. Toward the Four Corners, Central Rockies language flagged in Part 1. There's a second item buried in that same CPC outlook that deserves more attention than it's getting, because it's the next domino, not this one. The document flags that abnormal dryness and moderate drought expanded this past week across the Dakotas, where rapid onset drought is underway. And it explicitly connects that to the same mechanism from Part 2 and Part 3 of this video. Rising evapotranspiration, shrinking precipitation, and an elevated chance of the pattern spreading across more of the Great Plains and Corn Belt over the following 2 weeks. In plain terms, The drought and heat feedback loop that's been running under this ridge for weeks is now showing early signs of opening a second front, 1,000 miles from where this video started. So here is the actual watch list. 3 things, all public, all updating in real time, none of them requiring anything more than a browser. First, the Climate Prediction Center's probabilistic hazards outlook itself, updated daily. Watch the percentage risk band for the Great Basin and Southwest. If that number climbs back above 60% for the days beyond the 5th instead of continuing to shrink, the ridge is holding rather than ducking, and the weaken slightly, then re-intensify forecast from Part 1 has failed. Second, the Weather Prediction Center's extended forecast discussion, updated roughly every 12 hours. The specific phrase to watch for is whether the ridge is still described as centered over the western US or whether that language shifts toward the Four Corners and Central Rockies. That shift is the geographic pivot this whole pattern is forecast to make. Third, the US Drought Monitor, updated weekly, every Thursday. Watch specifically whether the rapid onset drought designation, now appearing in the Dakotas, spreads south into the Corn Belt, because that's the next region this feedback loop would compound over if the pattern holds through the middle of August, the way current guidance suggests it might. None of those 3 sources requires you to trust a single video, a single forecaster, or a single headline. They're the same documents every meteorologist quoted in this series has been pulling from all along. And they'll tell you which direction this goes before anyone gets around to reporting it. Part 7. The Ridge That Doesn't Break. 19,685 feet. That's where this video started. The altitude where a government forecaster wrote large and in charge about a structure most people will never hear named, 4 days before it started producing headlines under 3 different names in 3 different states. Here's what that number actually turned into. In Las Vegas, a city closing in on a 47-year-old August record, with an overnight low that stopped giving anyone's body a chance to recover. In Washington state, a warning label used for the first time in that state's history, sitting on top of drought numbers that were already running at 64% and fuel moisture that was already, in a federal researcher's own words, hitting record lows before the ridge even arrived. In the Ozarks, thunderstorms drawing their fuel from the same pattern's eastern edge. And in 2021, 5 years and a few hundred miles north of where this ridge is sitting now, the same physics. Sinking air, a drought-starved landscape, a block that refused to move. Produced a number that a UCLA team called a 1 in 10,000 year event, a Canadian village that broke its national heat record 3 days running and then burned to the ground, and 610 deaths that a mortality count had to go looking for because the death certificates alone wouldn't have found them. None of that happened because anyone built a machine to make it happen. That claim didn't survive contact with the numbers either. The scale problem alone rules it out. A 6,000 meter atmospheric structure spanning multiple states against a radio transmitter designed to study a layer of the atmosphere the weather never even reaches. What actually happened is smaller and, in its way, harder to sit with. A ridge did what ridges do, over ground that had already been drying out for weeks, at a moment when the baseline underneath all of it has shifted enough that the same mechanism now reaches further than it used to. The 2021 attribution study didn't find that global warming built that heat dome from nothing. It found that warming made the one that would have happened anyway 59% longer, 34% larger, 6% hotter at its peak. The ridge was always going to show up. What's changed is what it does once it's there. And right now, this week, the same document that predicted this ridge would weaken and then re-intensify is also the same document flagging something new. A rapid onset drought spreading across the Dakotas, 1,000 miles from where the extreme heat warnings are currently posted, with the same feedback loop just beginning to turn over in ground that hasn't dried out yet. That's not a forecast. It's an early flag in a probabilistic outlook, the kind of detail that sits quietly in a government document for days before anyone notices it's the thing that mattered. So here's where this actually leaves things, honestly, without inflating it past what the data supports. The ridge that's baking the Southwest this week is not 2021. Nothing in the current pattern says it's locking into the kind of a mega block that trapped that heat dome in place for the better part of a week, but the ingredients sitting underneath it. The drought, the dried fuel, the ridge measured against the same 600 decameter benchmark, a baseline quietly warmer than the one 2021 ran on top of, are the same ingredients in the same order that turned an ordinary summer ridge into the deadliest heat event in that region's recorded history. The physics doesn't care whether this is the year it happens again. It only cares whether the ingredients line up. Right now, 3 of them already have. The Climate Prediction Center says the ridge weakens starting the 3rd of August. The same document says it comes back, which means the actual question isn't whether this ridge breaks. The forecast already answered that. It's whether, the next time it reforms over ground this dry, it forms in the one place, over the one population, at the one moment where the margin has already run out. That hasn't happened yet. Watch the drought monitor. Watch the ridge. And watch what happens the day those 2 numbers finally line up in the same place at the same time.